Hey guys, BJ the Brave here, and today I'm going to be bringing you my first meta snapshot for Warhammer 40k Warpforge. Now, if you're just tuning into this, it is currently November 2023, and anyone who's played any competitive card games knows that metas change all the time. So the chances are that I will do this once a month, and the chances are that decks are going to constantly change as we figure out the meta and people adapt their decks to combat those armies that we're seeing, those deck lists that we're seeing most commonly on ladder. Okay, so the way I'm going to do my meta snapshot, and please feel free to comment and leave me any feedback in the comments if you're enjoying this approach, or if you've got any ideas about how we could do it better. Just drop me a quick note in the comments right now. Also, just cheekily, I'll just ask if you like the videos, subscribe to the channel. We're building loads of content out for this game, so if you're in it for the long haul, you want to see the game develop, then we need to follow and support content creators so we can obviously keep on making great content and videos for you. Anyway, back to it. So how I'm going to actually go about this is I'm going to look at the meta. I'm going to look at speak to top players and kind of look at get as much information as I can about kind of like decks that are performing well and best really for the people who are playing at the top of the ladder, so I can convey that in a meta report and you know what's going on. Now, in terms of the format, what I want to do is I want to use an S to C tier system. So S tier is kind of like where we have a meta where there is a deck, or more than one, that is kind of like in that S tier, that just sits like above the rest of the meta for a variety of reasons. Now, sometimes, some months, there might not be an S tier deck, right? So I'll make that clear as we go. So we're going to have an S tier, then we're going to have an A tier, then B, and then C. So this is the kind of format that I want to go with. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that if you have a deck that is S tier, that a B tier deck is inferior and can't beat an S tier deck. We always have to remember with a meta snapshot that, first of all, it completely depends on the player that's playing the deck and how much experience and what their understanding of the matchups are. And also, it often is the case that a deck that's an A tier deck or a B tier deck is a counter to the S tier deck. Okay, so I'll explain why I have got one deck that's S tier, and I'll explain why it's S tier. It doesn't necessarily mean it automatically beats other decks. So I just want to kind of clarify that before we jump in, because sometimes people can kind of oh, I lost to a C tier deck and I thought this was S tier, so I'm kind of just laying that out. Okay, cool. So let's jump in. So first and foremost, right now in the current meta, November, as I say, 2023, we do have an S tier deck. And the S tier deck is Manus, Calgar, Ultramarines. Now, for this specific example, I'm actually sharing my list. Okay, I've played this deck to the top, I think got as high as top 30, 32, something like that, before I switched decks and tried new things and lost a few points and whatnot. But this deck is being played by Soul, who is I think he's top 8 on the ladder, and I think it's also being played by a variety of other top 10 players. Now, you'll see a little bit of flavour changes between players. You'll see, for example, 3 or 4 cards that maybe one player prefers over another, but the core of what I'm showing you in this deck is the same in all of these top tier Manus Calgar decks. So what we've got is a really good kind of mid-range tempo based codex build. So for those of you familiar, obviously the codex ability, you spend all your mana and it triggers an ability, and you get to use cards like Tactical Insight to kind of refill your energy for 2 mana, and then you spend 2 mana and you get to trigger those codex abilities yet again. So here's one, for example, Deploy a Primus Intercessor. This card, for example, even though it got nerfed from 4 range attack to 3, this is still in most of the meta decks, and it can spam out intercessors and gain a real tempo gauge. A few other things to point out. By the way, if you want to see a full breakdown for this, I do have, check out my mid-range Ultramarines deck guide, which I've done, which goes into a full guide on this, including games and examples. So if you're interested, go and watch that video after this one. And again, like and subscribe. But what you're going to see here is this deck playing on tempo. It's got really good combos with this card in particular. I think it's one of the best cards in the deck. It blinds an enemy, so it puts their range to 0, and then something like a flanker comes on with high range attack, trades for free because my 4 attack versus your 0, and suddenly I'm just up on board, right? So the other reason, obviously it's got it builds its tempo, and then obviously finishes the game often with death from above. You've got Calgar's ability of 40 health, so it's really beefy and it can kind of last in most matches, and he can draw a card every single turn. So one of the reasons why this is S tier is not because it beats every deck every time, but the consistency of drawing these highly powerful cards is probably more consistent than some of the, say, A tier decks, for example. It has a very, very smooth curve. You know, if you don't draw this guy, the Primus Judicon 5, you're probably likely to draw your Impulsor or something to remove their 5-drop. So it just has a really, really well worked out curve, and some really powerful combat cards like Angels of Death, and some really powerful finishers like Calcius and the Death from Above. So for me, the reason why this is S tier is because it's easier to play than some of the other top tier decks. It requires fewer legendary plays, and it has a really good win rate in general across the board, right? So regardless of which faction or level of deck you're playing, this, you know, the game plan is simpler to follow, and it can pretty much beat anything if it's played well, and you get, you know, you play a nice curve. And it also has Humanity Shield, so in case of emergency, break open a Humanity Shield, whereby even if your opponent is about to burst you down and win, you pop Humanity Shield and you have this insane ability. I really do think this is one of the most broken legendaries, because your opponent just can't do anything about it, and you know, he could have you down to 1 health, you pop Humanity Shield, you can't be touched until next turn, and that often is what enables you that final turn to kind of take over and win the match. So overall, this for me is an S tier deck. As I say, you see some people run only 1 Calcius or 1 Angels of Death, or they might run a different combo of these 5-drops. Some people are playing like they are playing the Chaplain or the 6-drop that adds +1 across the board. So there's a few different. Some people play the 7th Company bikes. There is definitely different things you can do to kind of adapt this. But overall, you get the idea. This is definitely right now the S tier deck of the meta. Okay, so in A tier, I have actually got 3 decks in the A tier. So the first one I've got is the Imhotep Stormlord. So this is often known as the Necron Control build, and this deck that I'm sharing with you is from Goonstar, who doesn't have a ton of time to play on ladder, but he's been top 5. He played early beta. He's a great Necron player and knows this deck inside out. I also think that Lionel Johnson, who's number 1 on ladder, I don't know his deck exactly, but I'm pretty sure people have told me he's playing like this. He's playing Control, Necrons, and I know a lot of other top 50 players are playing this deck as well. So this is definitely a player right now in the meta, and again, it's not necessarily the easiest deck to play. I think when it's played correctly and you use things like your reconstitution protocols to raise the correct things from the graveyard, you make use of the synergies effectively, you can trigger remnants, it's just value town. And the longer the game goes on, this deck I would probably say more than almost any other deck in the game right now, the longer the game goes on, this deck just becomes more and more favourite, right? The odds at the bookies are just swinging more and more in Imhotep's favour the longer the game goes on. There's some fantastic combos. For example, turn 9 you can play Curse of the Pharaoh with Scythe Assault. That deals a massive 5 to 6 damage on all enemies. You can do things like Hexmat Destroyer and Curse to also trigger AoE. So there's lots of different ways of doing AoE. And of course the big one is Tomb World. Like Tomb World, when you look at the quality of the minions in this deck, like Lich Guards for example, and Necron Lord, like the quality that this of minions that this card brings back for 8 mana is just insane, and quite frankly game winning. So unless your opponent's got drawn the cards and has a game plan to play around this, which even that's difficult to do, then Tomb World just often wins games on its own, quite frankly. Yeah, it's got everything. It's got hard removal, it's got good AoE, it's got strong minions, and it's got the reanimating ability, which is a high value mechanic. Some people don't run Necron Lord. I really want to try the 9-drop Oberon. I just don't have that card just yet. I also want to try, Goonstar was talking about, he runs the 3-drop Destroyer Legendary, which I also don't have. There's a little bit of flavour there. You can play 2 Cursors, you can play 2 Technomancers. Some people don't run Extermination Protocol, but I just find that flexibility for 1 mana of doing 2 damage, which can be face as well, and that cheap stratagem to combine with things like Plasmancer, to combine with things like Hexmaster Destroyer, to combine with, of course, your Technomancer to raise your units, or to combine with a Psychomancer to stun your opponent's units. Those cheap spells are a premium in this deck, so I think that the Extermination Protocols are a good choice. So yeah, Imatech Storm Control Necron, that is definitely A tier for me right now. Also in the A tier, we're gonna go with the Eldar. So the Tempo Eldar. So this deck has been played by Demos, who's carried this deck all the way up to, I believe, 5th on ladder right now. Other players also are running it in the top 50. There tends to be 2 Eldar builds at the minute that are doing well. One is revolving around a sort of control deck with what's his name? This guy with Keltalk. So a more control build with the 7-drop. What's the 7-drop called? Reclaim the Stars. So spending, drawing 5 cards and reducing them and having a huge tempo play late game. That's the other Eldar deck you can go down, but I think right now, in terms of like the very top of ladder, I think the Tempo Eldar is really good. And another reason that makes this A tier is it has a good matchup against the Marines. So the S tier deck that we talked about. This deck, when you know what to do with it, when you draw correctly and you play out on the tempo correctly, this deck can actually out-tempo Marines. So it's a really powerful deck right now in the meta, and it deals pretty well with most things once you know how to play it. Some of the downsides are obviously that it does run out of cards, so you do need to get the game over with sort of by turn 9 or something, or generally you're going to run out of steam a little bit, so you've got to make good use of your hero stratagem when using this deck. But ultimately, this isn't a deck guide. I just want to say that this deck is a top tier deck, and I'm putting this in A tier for now. And we've got one final deck which I also believe is A tier at the minute, and that is Oberon. This is the Tempo Scarabs. Guys, if you're liking this so far, if you haven't already, please like the video, because it tells me like you want to do meta reports, and I can do more of them going forward. But also, I was going to say, I have done a proper full-on guide for Tempo Scarabs, so if you're interested in how this deck works, go ahead and have a look at that video afterwards. Anyway, Tempo Scarabs is really good. One of the great things about this is it has a really good matchup into the Eldar deck that I just talked to you about previously. So this is like one of the really strong counters to that deck. And again, it gives Necron players a very different way of playing. It's very different to the control style. This deck is much more about playing out things on tempo. It's about trying to make really good use of your Scarabs to try and keep filling the board with Scarabs, while still developing, having a few quality minions, whether that be the Chronomancer or your Lich Guards to protect your units, and ultimately play into the Triarch Stalker, which just is insane in this deck. It just buffs everything, range damage, and a board full of Scarabs, it gives you a +14 worth of range damage basically, so which can attack that turn that the Stalker comes down. So it's a really powerful finisher. So this deck, as I say, I've got a full guide if you want to watch it, but this is also A tier. It's also being played at a very high level on ladder, and it does counter some of the like I say, some of the top decks. It can really play into most things, so this is a really good deck. Okay, so in the B tier then, I have one deck in the B tier, which I think this deck is just a little bit below the Tempo Eldar, the Tempo Scarabs, and the which other one did we just say? I'm confused myself already. And the Control Necrons. The one that I think is just below that is the Control Orcs. Now, I really love Orcs. I have to say, I think Orcs might be my favourite faction just in terms of how they play so far. There's a really good aggro deck, so shout out to the Ecclesiarch. He came up with a pretty good aggro deck. I think there's nothing in that deck that's above 4 energy. He's got a great video on that. If you want to go and check out his channel, please do. And that deck's pretty cool. So I was trying to figure out, like, I think both decks can be good, but I do think overall that in a meta snapshot, that the control deck is probably being played at the highest level. So this deck in particular, I got from Cube Catton. So Cube Catton is currently ranked 4th on ladder, and he's been running Orc Control. And the thing with this deck is it kind of has the tools to do anything. It can deal with anything, and it's one of the things I like about it. Now, what lets it down then, BJ? Well, the thing that lets it down is you've got to draw those tools, right? So now, what helps with that is Gruck Face Ripper, because obviously his talent is to draw a troop from your deck, so you can get troops into hand, and that also thins your deck, meaning that on your start of your turn, when you naturally draw a card, you're more likely then to be able to draw into your stratagems that you need. You also run cards like Prophet of the War, which enable you to pull a stratagem from your deck of your choice. So we do put things in there to try and give it the consistency it needs, because quite honestly, guys, like this is a deck that, with a few nerfs in the meta and one or two, you know, I could see this deck becoming like right towards the top of the meta. It's not that far away. Like I say, it's got the AoE and the Scorcher, the Burner Voice Spanner combo, the Will of Gork. So it's got fantastic removal there. It's got hard removal in Will of Gork and in No Mucking About. It's got really insane tempo swings when you play out the Green Horde and you just flood the board with all your cheap troops, and you can even do things like Arda's Nails and then buff the health of all those. That's very difficult for your opponent to clear when you do that, even with AoE if you get the Arda's Nails off. And then it's got the ultimate finisher in, well, I say the ultimate finisher, it's between that and Tomb World, right? Like, you get Rock Invasion off and you've pretty much won the game. So this deck has tons and tons of potential. It's also got some of the best legendaries in the game in there, in terms of like Makari and the Orc Knob. So it's a very, very strong deck. It can definitely beat any of the decks we've talked about so far. But right now, the inconsistency of it and the fragility, I think, of Gruck Face Ripper, because you often don't want to attack with him and you want to make use of his power, I think it just holds it back slightly. So that's why I'm putting this in the B tier. Okay, so that's my S tier, my A and my B. They are the 5 decks I think that you want to be looking at when trying to understand the current meta. In C tier, where does that leave us then? Well, sadly, that leaves us with all of our Tyranid builds and ultimately all of our Chaos builds. Now, I am sure and I'm confident that somebody out there is close, and probably more so with Tyranids, but I'm sure that we will see those 2 decks. I think when we see the next round of kind of buffs and nerfs, I think we'll probably start to see Tyranids and Chaos really coming to life. So, you know, they're not, you know, they're not doing too well at the minute, but their time will come for sure. But right now, I think that the Tyranids and the Chaos sadly are sitting down in C tier. So that's it, guys. So thank you very much for watching. As I said, please like and subscribe and let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this, or if there's any feedback you've got. I'd love to hear what you think of this content, and I'll definitely take on board any steers, any suggestions to try and improve the videos for you. Hope you enjoyed that, and I plan to do more of these going forward. Until the next one, I'll see you next time.